step into the glittering yet confining world of royal pageantry, where every polished surface hides a crack, just waiting to be revealed. This is the story of Princess Margaret Rose, born into privilege, yet forever ensnared by duty. A princess who dared to push beyond the stiff, buttoned-up expectations of the British monarchy. From the day she took her first breath at Glamis Castle to the final years shadowed by heartbreak and scandal, Margaret's life was a high-wired dance between tradition and rebellion. Tonight, we'll uncover how she navigated the line between royal decorum and personal desire, shocking a monarchy that rarely budged but never quite reined in her fiery spirit. She was born into a world of crowns and corgis, centuries-old traditions and tabloid headlines, a place where gilded carriages might glide through the streets one day and a scandal might erupt the next. This was the universe that Princess Margaret Rose entered on August 21st, 1930, at Glamis Castle in Scotland. A location so steeped in history that it felt as though her very first breath carried a chorus of royal whispers. She was the second daughter of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, a spunky younger sister to the future Queen Elizabeth II, and the press was quick to anoint her a sparkling figure in Britain's post-war monarchy. Yet for all the glitter in her early life, there was always an undercurrent of rebellion in her heart, a flicker that grew into a raging flame, eventually shocking a monarchy that prided itself on decorum. What people sometimes forget about Margaret is that, yes, she was born into unimaginable privilege, but she also inherited constraints that caged her spirit. To be a spare in the royal family meant existing in the shadow of the heir, locked in a role that demanded flawless obedience and unwavering composure. Those very rules clashed mightily with a personality too big to box up, leading to a saga of glamour, scandal, and heartbreak that made headlines for decades. Margaret's childhood was cloistered but surprisingly warm. A bubble of busy palace corridors and meticulously groomed Windsor Castle lawns. If you ever look at photos of her as a child, you might see the same cherubic grin you'd expect from any little girl. Someone enthralled by bedtime stories, family dogs, and the occasional bit of mischief. But the difference was that her father, King George VI, had ascended the throne unexpectedly in 1936 after the abdication of Edward the Eighth, thrusting Margaret into the precarious position of second in line. This shift changed everything. She was no ordinary child. She was a princess who would never ascend to the highest seat, but would always be scrutinized, as though the fate of the crown rested on her shoulders. She had a knack for music, devouring piano lessons and flirting with the idea of ballet. People around her might have marveled at her quick wit, describing her as both clever and cheeky, a combination that won hearts, but also laid the groundwork for the rebellious streak that would later scandalize polite society. In those early days, Margaret idolized her father. Some accounts say she was his favorite, that her playful irreverence and big personality amused him in ways that the more dutiful Elizabeth could not. Losing him in 1952 to lung cancer at the heartbreaking age of 56 shook Margaret to her core. She was 21, blossoming into adulthood, but forced to watch her sister crowned queen at just 25. In an instant, the royal center of gravity shifted. Elizabeth wore the crown, and Margaret was left to redefine her purpose in an environment that had little room for spares to craft their own identity. This thirst for significance, some might call it restlessness, became her hallmark. She partied with aristocrats, danced until dawn, occasionally lit up a room with a cutting remark that could be either wickedly funny or pointedly cruel. The press gobbled it up. In Britain's austere post-war climate, Margaret's escapades in nightclubs and the company of bohemian artists offered a thrilling dose of drama. She was the party princess before tabloids even had that phrase locked and loaded. They adored her, but they also turned on her whenever she crossed a moral line, which happened more often than the monarchy might have liked. One of the first major shocks to the system came through her romance with Group Captain Peter Townsend. He was no dashing prince, but a divorced RAF officer and equerry to her father. While modern audiences might shrug at such a relationship, in 1953, this was more or less the equivalent of detonating a bomb in the royal corridors. Margaret, barely 22, was seen in public acting rather familiar with Townsend, a small gesture like brushing lint off his jacket at Elizabeth II's coronation. But that gesture ripped open a debate about whether the monarchy could tolerate another crisis, reminiscent of Edward VIII's abdication. She was starry-eyed. He was older, a commoner, divorced, a father of two. And the Church of England was far from ready to accommodate any royal union that smelled like a scandal. Winston Churchill's government, allegedly, was none too pleased either. Elizabeth tried to support her sister, but duty came first. The monarchy whispered and cajoled. Politicians weighed in, and Margaret faced an agonizing choice: marry Townsend and risk the monarchy's stability, or relinquish the man she loved to remain a loyal princess. By 1955, her heart was battered. She released a statement that she would not marry him, citing her responsibilities to the Commonwealth. Some lauded her sacrifice. Others believed she was manipulated. In either case, it left her gutted and resentful. An early lesson that the monarchy's demands might well bulldoze her personal happiness. Some claim that the Townsend affair hardened her spirit, fueling a cycle of embitterment that manifested in defiant behavior. She smoked incessantly, reportedly up to 60 cigarettes a day at her peak, raised her glass to gin and tonics more often than the palace would have preferred, and sharpened her wit until it could slice through unsuspecting socialites. She moved with a crowd sometimes dubbed the Margaret Set, a who's who of creatives and aristocrats. They drank, partied, and saw themselves as the new wave of cultural sophisticates. But the monarchy wanted a clean, respectable image, especially after the war. So Margaret became a polarizing figure, luminous and fun to watch from a distance, but also unpredictable, sometimes rude, and seemingly uninvested in conforming to the royal mold. She'd approach famous actresses at parties and instruct them to be more regal, as if she was dishing out a playful command. But those who experienced her scorn said her sarcasm could sting like a viper, leaving a bruised ego in its wake. Yet in 1960, she seemed to find a path toward happily ever after with Anthony Armstrong Jones. He was a daring photographer, charismatic, slightly bohemian, and apparently unfazed by the notion of marrying into the House of Windsor. Their wedding was a global spectacle. Cameras broadcast the ceremony to millions, making it the first fully televised royal wedding. For a moment, when it looked like Margaret had struck gold. Here she was, forging a more modern union, bridging the gap between aristocracy and creative circles. They had two children, David, born in 1961, and Sarah, born in 1964, and if you peeked at their family photos, you might think they were forging an exciting new brand of monarchy. But behind those polished appearances, trouble simmered. Margaret and Tony, as some called him, were both tempestuous, both used to commanding attention, and apparently both skilled at stepping outside their marital vows. Stories of Tony's various affairs drifted into the rumor mill, including one with actress Jackie Chan. Meanwhile, Margaret was no saint in the fidelity department either. Whispers of her own dalliances popped up in tabloids. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, they were more like two individuals drifting in parallel orbits, their fights turning uglier, their separate social circles fueling the gossip pages. The break came in 1976, with photos that ignited a new wave of scandal. Margaret, now in her mid-40s, was photographed on a Caribbean beach with Roddy Llewellyn, a man 17 years younger. She wore a swimsuit. He looked boyish and carefree, and the press lost its collective mind. The monarchy reeled. The concept of a middle-aged princess cavorting with a younger lover on a tropical island was more sensational than anything they'd handled since the Townsend fiasco. Moustique, the private island where Margaret owned a villa, called Les Jolies Chesta, soon became synonymous with her hedonistic escapes, a sun-drenched fantasy where rock stars like Mick Jagger might swing by. This was prime tabloid gold. Not long after the pictures made headlines, Tony announced their separation, and by 1978, Margaret was the first senior royal to divorce since the days of Henry VIII. If that wasn't enough of a bombshell, the press feasted on the narrative of a carefree, chain-smoking princess, partying in paradise, while the monarchy tried to keep a stiff upper lip back home. The public was torn. Some saw her as a reckless rebel who tarnished the crown. Others pitied her quest for love and authenticity in a world that demanded rigid compliance. Roddy Llewellyn, for all the scorn heaped upon him by the tabloids, was reportedly a stabilizing force, albeit temporary. Their relationship lasted until around 1981. But the damage to Margaret's public image had been done. The monarchy braced itself for each new headline about her drinking, her chain smoking, her supposed tantrums over protocol. It was rumored she'd insist that even close friends address her as ma'am in private settings, revealing a contradictory mix of arrogance and insecurity. Over time, the health consequences of her lifestyle began to manifest. She suffered a lung operation in 1985 to remove a benign tumor, presumably connected to her heavy smoking. Whispers of hepatitis in the 1970s also raised eyebrows. As the years rolled on, she sustained a series of strokes that slowly stripped away the vigor that had defined her for so long. By the end of the 1990s, she was often seen in a wheelchair, partially blind, and battling to maintain any semblance of the spark she once carried. If you consider Margaret's life as a narrative arc, the tragedies began early and never let up. She lost her beloved father, felt overshadowed by her sister's ascension, was denied the man she truly adored, Townsend, found fleeting happiness in a marriage that soon crumbled, and endured the humiliations of public divorce. In 1997, the royal family faced another heartbreak when her niece-in-law, Princess Diana, died tragically. Although Margaret wasn't known to be particularly close to Diana, the relentless media storm around that event likely stirred uncomfortable echoes of her own experience under the press's gaze. Margaret grew increasingly isolated, feeling neglected by Elizabeth, according to some accounts. Her children grew up and faced their own trials, David dealing with business ventures and trying to carve out an identity, while Sarah led a quieter life. The monarchy itself was modernizing, inching toward a less rigid approach, but ironically, that modernization wasn't enough to free Margaret from the stifling confines of her own reputation. In her final years, Margaret was a pale shadow of the flamboyant, witty princess who once danced until dawn and sliced through conversation with a sardonic one-liner. She succumbed to a final stroke on February the 9th, 2002, passing away at King Edward VII's Hospital in London at the age of 71. The funeral was subdued, attended by the Queen and dignitaries, but it lacked the overwhelming outpouring of grief that had followed Diana's death 5 years earlier. Perhaps the public had grown numb to Margaret's presence, or maybe they saw her as the last vestige of an old-school monarchy that had scandalized them enough. Whatever the reason, her passing was a significant moment. The end of an era where royals didn't readily confess their vulnerabilities to cameras, yet their missteps were plastered across headlines in bold type. Her funeral might have been quiet, but her story still echoes. Royal watchers recall her fashion statements, from the statement hats to the emerald necklaces, and the swirl of parties filled with witty banter. Historians note that her presence forced the monarchy to modernize, albeit grudgingly, in areas like divorce and personal choice. Younger generations glimpse her in documentaries and dramatizations, marveling at how someone could embody both the glitz and the sorrow of a life determined by birthright. She was rarely out of the headlines in her prime, but as the years slip by, we see her less as the troublemaker and more as a woman whose spirit was irreconcilable with her role. She remains a paradox wrapped in velvet gloves, the glamorous rebel whose sense of duties was overshadowed by personal heartbreak, the party girl princess who both defined and reinforced the monarchy's stifling codes. On one hand, her personal scandals, particularly the Townsend heartbreak, softened the path for future royals to break away from tradition. Had Margaret been allowed to marry Townsend, maybe the monarchy would have adapted earlier to a changing world, in which divorced individuals could find acceptance. On the other hand, her fiascos, like the public meltdown of her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones and the widely publicized Mustique romance with Llewellyn, damaged the monarchy's image. She was a cautionary tale about what happens when an individual with a massive personality is forced into a rigid institution that prizes emotional restraint above nearly everything else. Culturally, Margaret left her footprints in more than just gossip columns. She was a patron of the arts, especially the Royal Ballet and Sadler's Wells, championing cultural endeavors that still resonate in Britain's artistic circles. She was also associated with the style and flair of the 1960s and 1970s, regularly showing up at events dripping in diamonds, sporting avant-garde fashions, and exuding an almost celebrity-like aura that bridged old-world royalty and new-world glam. Even her moustique villa, Les Jolies Eaux, stands as an emblem of escapism, a place where, ironically, she found temporary relief from the constraints of palace life. In some ways, Margaret's life is an epic cautionary tale, proof that monarchy, for all its pomp, can be a gilded cage. She was neither a hero nor a villain, but something in between, a complicated soul who tried to fuse personal freedom with a mandated sense of duty. Sometimes that clash yielded scandalous headlines, sometimes it produced heartbreak, and sometimes it gave us fleeting glimpses of a princess who, for all her flaws, had the capacity to dazzle a room. One imagines her in those final days, perhaps reflecting on the Townsend romance that set the course of her life, the marriage that went down in flames, the children she loved, and the monarchy that never gave her a chance to be anything other than the spare. Even now, when the subject of royal rebels arises, Margaret's name surfaces swiftly. Was she the black sheep, or simply the only one who dared to call out the stifling gloom of palace life? Ask a dozen people, get a dozen answers. But the conflicting narratives all point to one truth. Princess Margaret was larger than life, too grand to be contained by tradition, yet too royal to break entirely free. She danced on the line between duty and desire, and that dance cost her dearly. Today, if you visit Mustique, you might stroll along the beaches and imagine her silhouette against the setting sun, gin in hand, cackling at some witty joke while a radio plays in the background. You might wonder what joys and regrets swirled through her mind as she looked at that horizon. She could have perhaps fled the monarchy altogether, but she didn't. She remained, fought the institution from inside, and ultimately bore the scars of that fight. Her life resonates because it touches on something deeply human, the longing for love, the battle against impossible expectations, the heartbreak of being told no by forces bigger than ourselves. And that is why, for all the tabloids that named her a scandalous princess, for all the protocols she broke, and for all the health crises she endured, she remains a figure of enduring fascination. She was the rose who bloomed in the monarchy's rigid garden, thorns and all, never afraid to show the world her petals might be torn, her leaves a bit withered, but her spirit unwilling to be fully contained.